The summer Shelby Myers turned 32. She redesigned the identity for a regional seed company out of Concord, and the CEO sent a bottle of champagne to her studio with a handwritten card that said, "You made us look like we've been here forever." She kept the card pinned above her desk for 3 years, until the desk itself disappeared into the guest room that nobody ever used, and the card got filed somewhere she stopped looking. That was before. The before is relevant. She had come to graphic design the way she came to most things, sideways, through necessity, by outworking people who had more obvious advantages. Her mother had kept the lights on at a BP station in Kankakee for 22 years. Shelby had gotten herself a scholarship to DePaul and spent her early 20s building a client list out of business cards and cold emails and a single-minded refusal to produce work she wasn't proud of. By 28, she had a studio, a reputation, and a savings account she'd filled herself, dollar by dollar. She had the particular confidence of someone who has never been given anything they didn't earn. Then she met David Roach at a fundraiser in Chicago, and David Roach was charming in the specific way of men who have always known things would work out for them, and she had mistaken that ease for security. She understood this later. At the time, she just liked him. The Roach family were not unkind to Shelby, exactly. Unkindness would have been easier to name. Alina Roach had the manner of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of the compliment that wasn't quite one. "You look so healthy," she said, the first Thanksgiving. "We were worried David had moved too fast, but you're very grounded for someone with your kind of background." She said background the way other people said situation, and she always seemed genuinely surprised when Shelby had opinions about things. Robert Roach barely registered her. Not out of cruelty, it was more total than that, more like a man whose peripheral vision simply did not extend to women who hadn't been introduced to him through his own networks. He asked her once, in their 3rd year of marriage, what she'd studied in school. She told him. He nodded the way people nod when they've already stopped listening. And then there was Blake. Blake Roach was 36, ran a PR consultancy in Cambridge, and had the gift of always sounding like she was making a private joke that everyone else was desperate to be in on. She'd been cordial at the wedding, almost warm, but cordiality was a register she reserved for public occasions. In private family spaces, she said the kinds of things that required the rest of the table to look at their plates for a moment and then keep eating. Shelby's design thing, she would say, not meanly, just casually, just in the way that made it clear she'd filed it under decorative hobby and closed the drawer. The design thing, in the 2nd year of their marriage, had been doing fairly well. Shelby had brought her clients to Boston, built new ones, taken on a young assistant for 8 months. Then a major account walked because a conflict of interest had developed with an agency the client had merged with. Nothing personal, business. And David suggested that maybe this was a good time for her to step back, catch her breath, stop stressing, because they certainly didn't need the money and he'd be making partners soon anyway. She had stepped back. She'd told herself it was temporary. The 3rd year, there was a pregnancy that ended at 11 weeks. David was at a conference in Dallas. She called him and he booked a flight home and he held her hand and he was genuinely sad. She believed that, had always believed it, but in the weeks after, when she needed something she couldn't fully articulate, he was distracted by the partnership process, and she was alone in a house that was exactly the right size for 3 people and all wrong for one. Alina came over once and sat across the kitchen island and said, in a tone that was attempting to be helpful, that these things often sorted themselves out when women reduced their stress levels and got more rest. Blake called 2 weeks after and said, in a voice that sounded sincerely curious, whether Shelby had been pushing too hard, "I just mean with the whole freelance anxiety thing. Bodies know," she said. "It's not a judgment. It's just science." Only Rachel had driven up from Portland without being asked and slept on the couch for 4 days, and not said anything much at all except, "I'm here, and do you want more tea?" The Roach family summer barbecue had been held on the 3rd Saturday of July for longer than the children could remember, in the backyard of the Brookline house where Alina and Robert had lived for 30 years. It was a production, a caterer, a bartender, a tent, seasonal flowers in glass vases on round tables. The family occupied the center, the guests, mostly colleagues and neighbors, arrayed around the edges. Shelby had attended 6 of these barbecues and had always felt like she was watching them from the edges, even when she was at the center table. She had spent the spring finishing a brand identity project for a Boston area restaurant group. Her first real project in 2 years, scoped small, priced conservatively, but done, completed, delivered, and the clients had been pleased. It was not a major accomplishment by the standards of her earlier work, but it had felt, privately, like something she was clawing back from somewhere. She'd been thinking about how to talk about it in a way that would land. She chose her moment after the plates had been cleared. Robert was in the middle of one of his winding stories about a consultancy competitor, and when he paused to drink, she said, too eagerly, she knew even as she said it that she'd just finished a brand identity package and the restaurant group was already getting inquiries. She watched the table adjust to this information, the way people adjust when something unexpected is placed in front of them and they're not sure what to do with it. Blake, who had been looking at her phone, looked up. I mean, good for you, she said, but can I be honest? And she paused the way she always paused, the pause that made it clear honesty was the last thing coming. If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice. That's how dull this has become. A half-second of silence, and then laughter. Not cruel laughter, almost reflexive. Like the table had been waiting for permission to release something. Even David laughed, just once, just briefly, the way he always did with his family, not because something was funny, but because the alternative required more will than he had. Shelby looked at the tablecloth for a moment. Then she picked up her glass, looked at Blake directly, not with heat, just with steadiness, and said, "Challenge accepted." Nobody knew quite what she meant. That was fine. She knew. She left on a Tuesday. She was methodical about it. She took her professional equipment, her files, her personal documents. She settled the one joint credit card balance and transferred her half of the savings to her own account, which was technically her account anyway and had always been. She wrote a letter to David that was 3 pages long and said everything she needed to say, which was not that she hated him, because she didn't. It was more complicated and more boring than hate. She didn't include a destination. She left the letter on the kitchen island, where it couldn't be missed. She drove to Logan and flew to Portland before anyone woke up. The Roach family's response, from what she could observe at a distance, was primarily social. Alina posted a vague Instagram caption about difficult seasons testing us. Blake texted David's phone, which Shelby knew because David's iCloud was still connected to the laptop she'd taken, and she read 3 messages that were all variations on "I'm sure she just needs space." Robert, as far as she could tell, did not comment at all. David's messages to her escalated over the first 2 weeks, worried, then confused, then a specific controlled anger about the way she'd done it, and then slowed, and then, by the 6th week, stopped. Not once in any of the messages did he mention what Blake had said. She wasn't surprised. That was somehow the most clarifying thing. Rachel had a 2-bedroom apartment in the Alberta Arts District and an inflatable mattress she'd already set up by the time Shelby landed. She didn't ask questions for the first week. She made coffee, and they watched television, and one evening Shelby sat down and cried for almost an hour straight without being entirely sure what she was crying about, and Rachel sat next to her and didn't try to make it into anything. After the first week, Rachel asked, "What do you actually want to do?" Shelby said she wanted to work again, properly. She found Dr. Sandra Cole through her insurance, a therapist who worked out of a pale green office on Any Glisson and who had the specific skill of asking questions that seemed obvious until Shelby tried to answer them. Their sessions, every Thursday, became the scaffolding around which she was slowly building something. She was learning, in a way she hadn't before, to trace the shape of the last 7 years without excusing anyone, including herself. She'd made choices. Some of them were understandable. All of them had contributed. The coffee shop on Albina, Prospect, was where she found Stacy. Stacy ran the place with her wife, had been there for 11 years, had hands that were always either typing or wiping down the counter. She noticed Shelby doing design work on her laptop over the course of 3 weeks before she said, bluntly, on a Thursday morning, "What is that? What are you working on?" Shelby showed her. A logo exercise just for herself, something she was trying to get back into. Stacy looked at it for a long time. "It's careful," she finally said, "like you're asking permission." That stung, which meant it was accurate. They worked something out. Stacy commissioned a new menu design, a takeout bag, an updated signage system. Small money. But in the process, Stacy pushed her in the specific way of someone who has no patience for people withholding their own capabilities. She would look at a draft and say, "What were you actually going for?" Or "Why did you make this choice specifically?" Or occasionally, "This is the safe version, is that what you wanted?" She wasn't warm about it. She had her own limits and her own preferences, and she disagreed with Shelby sometimes and said so. It was, somehow, exactly what Shelby needed. The menu went out and got photographed for a food publication, and Stacy showed Shelby the image without ceremony. "See, that's what happens when you stop asking permission." A regional food brand came next, through a referral, and that became an 8-month campaign that got entered in a regional industry competition and placed second, which was enough to get noticed. Shelby began getting inquiries again. She took on a small studio space in the Pearl District and a part-time assistant, and stopped thinking of herself as someone who used to have a career. The divorce was handled by lawyers and was uncomplicated. David was fair about it. She'd expected nothing less. He was, at the core of it, a decent man who had loved her in the ways available to him, which had not been enough, but which were real. She signed the papers in October and took back her name, Myers, the name she'd built her reputation under before she'd ever met any of them. She'd already accepted the contract before she knew who the client was. It was a national rebrand commission, a subsidiary of a holding company she hadn't heard of, a premium food and hospitality brand seeking a new identity across all touchpoints. Significant scope, good money, exactly the kind of project she'd been working toward. She was 6 weeks in when she was preparing the formal presentation materials and looked up the parent company and saw the name, Roach Group Consulting. She sat with this information for a long time. Then she kept working. The gala was held at a hotel in the Pearl District, and it was the kind of industry event where the room was full of people who were networking but performing at ease. Shelby arrived in a black dress she'd bought specifically for herself, which was a small thing that felt significant, and she had a drink and talked to a few people she'd been building relationships with over the past year, and she was, she realized, having a fine time. She saw Robert first, near the bar, and he looked at her the way people look at someone they recognize but can't immediately place. She could see the moment it landed. "Shelby," he said. "Robert," she accepted his handshake. "I'm the lead designer on the Belgrove project." He didn't know what to do with that. He said it was good work. She thanked him. They moved on. Eleanor was across the room by the window, and Eleanor saw her coming and seemed to brace slightly, and then composed herself into graciousness. "Shelby, you look wonderful." "Thank you, Eleanor. You too." "We didn't know. David didn't mention." "The work speaks for itself," Shelby said, without unkindness. "That's the point." Blake was near the coat check, talking to someone, and when she saw Shelby, she went very still for a moment. She was wearing a rust-colored blazer, and she looked, Shelby noticed, tired in a way she hadn't before. She excused herself from her conversation. "I didn't know you'd be here," Blake said. "Neither did I initially." They stood across from each other. Blake opened her mouth and then closed it, which was, Shelby thought, probably the most honest thing she'd ever seen her do. "The project is good," Blake said finally. "The work is actually good." "I know," Shelby said. She moved on before it could become anything else. David she found at the far end of the room, and he saw her and went through several expressions in rapid succession before landing on something careful and genuine. He looked older, or maybe just more present. She'd heard through Rachel that he was in therapy. She believed it. They talked briefly, and she thought, "I don't need anything from him." It was the first time that had been completely true. He called the next morning and asked if he could take her for coffee. She said yes. They sat at a small place near the hotel, and he said the things he'd been building up to for months, she could tell. That he was sorry he hadn't said anything that night. That he'd known for longer than he'd admitted that something was wrong with how his family treated her, and he'd chosen not to see it because seeing it would have required something of him. He was in therapy. He was working on it. He was not asking for anything. She listened. She believed him. "I don't have anything I need to settle with you," she said. "I want you to know that. There's no account I'm running." He nodded. "I just want my life back," she said, "and I have it so." She left the coffee shop and walked along the river and felt, not triumphant, not vindicated, just clear. The way a room feels after you've opened the windows. The farmer's market on Mississippi ran every Saturday through the summer, and Shelby had made a routine of it. Fresh bread, whatever vegetables looked good, coffee from the cart by the entrance. She was examining tomatoes in late August when she heard a voice say her name. Blake was standing a few feet away in a linen shirt, visibly pregnant, 6 months, maybe 7, and holding a small paper bag of peaches. Without the event context armor, she looked like a person who had recently been reminded that she was going to be responsible for someone. "Hi," Shelby said. "Hi," Blake looked at the tomatoes. "I didn't know you'd moved here." "About 14 months ago." A pause. A vendor offered them samples of something. They both declined. "I'm taking a parenting class," Blake said, which seemed to come from nowhere except that it clearly came from somewhere. They talk a lot about modeling, how children learn what they deserve from how you treat them." She stopped. "I've been thinking about some things I've said, over the years." Shelby set down a tomato. She waited. "I don't want," Blake started and started again. "I don't want them to feel like they have to disappear to be seen. That's not." She seemed frustrated with herself. "I'm trying to say something and I'm doing it badly." "You're doing fine," Shelby said. "I was unkind to you, consistently, and I told myself it was just family dynamic stuff, but it wasn't only that." Shelby looked at her. Blake was not asking for forgiveness. She was asking, Shelby thought, for something smaller, acknowledgement that she was trying to be a different person than she'd been. "I know," Shelby said. "I think your kid is going to be okay." She didn't mean it as absolution. She meant it as what it was. A small, human thing offered across the distance of a farmer's market, on an ordinary Saturday, between two people who had not been good for each other. Blake nodded. She moved on. Shelby bought her tomatoes. She'd bought the house in March, a bungalow in the Woodstock neighborhood with a deep front porch and a Japanese maple in the yard that she hadn't planted. She'd chosen it for the light in the studio room and for the way the neighborhood sounded on a weekend morning, not quiet exactly, but unhurried. She'd paid cash. It had taken her breath away to do it, and then the breath came back and it was her house. She was writing in her journal on the porch on a Sunday in early September when she noticed that the maple had started to turn. Not dramatically, just the first edge of it, the earliest suggestion of what was coming. She wrote for a while and then stopped and looked at the street and looked at the tree. She had not become visible by demanding to be seen. She had not made herself known by refusing to disappear. She had left and rebuilt and done the work and bought a house, and those were not acts of defiance. They were just her life, resumed. Or maybe more accurately, begun. The journal sat open on the railing. The maple turned in the September light. She picked up her pen and kept writing.